"You're nothing but a gold digger. You'll never be part of this family," Garrett hissed, his words slicing through the cheerful buzz of the Blackwood family reunion. I stood frozen, champagne flute trembling in my hand, as my husband's cousin continued his tirade just loud enough for nearby relatives to hear, but not quite loud enough to cause a scene. "Noah only married you for your business sense. Once he's secured full ownership of our company, he'll trade you in for someone worthy of the Blackwood name." I should have seen this moment coming. The subtle jabs during holiday gatherings, the way conversations stopped when I entered rooms at the sprawling Blackwood estate, the evaluating glances that measured my worth based on my modest upbringing, rather than the financial advisory firm I'd built from nothing. Yet somehow, this public humiliation at the family's annual 4th of July celebration, held at the historic Blackwood mansion that had housed 5 generations, still blindsided me. Noah was across the meticulously landscaped lawn, deep in conversation with his uncle Preston, the family patriarch. My husband of 3 years hadn't noticed Garrett's attack, or how the small circle of Blackwood cousins had fallen silent, their expressions ranging from uncomfortable to secretly pleased. "I need to check on the caterers," I managed, my voice steadier than I felt. Years of negotiating with difficult clients had taught me something valuable: never show weakness. As I walked away, head high despite the burning humiliation, I heard Garrett's girlfriend Vanessa giggle. Poor Olivia. She really thought marrying into money would make her belong. The irony would have made me laugh if I weren't fighting back tears. I hadn't married Noah for his family's wealth. I had my own successful business. What these blue-blooded heirs to a crumbling textile empire didn't know was that their precious, generational wealth was mostly smoke and mirrors now. And I was one of the few people who understood just how precarious the Blackwood financial situation had become. I found temporary sanctuary in the mansion's cavernous kitchen, nodding to the catering staff while I collected myself. Through the window, I could see Noah still engaged with Preston, their conversation appearing increasingly tense. Another business discussion, no doubt. Another secret plan I wasn't supposed to know about. "There you are." The voice behind me belonged to Camille, Noah's sister, and the only Blackwood who had ever shown me genuine kindness. "I've been looking everywhere for you." "Just needed some air," I said, forcing a smile. Camille's eyes narrowed. "Garrett said something, didn't he? That smug look on his face when you walked away was a dead giveaway." I hesitated, unwilling to create more family drama. Camille sighed, pulling me into an alcove away from curious ears. "Listen, Olivia, there's something you should know." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I overheard Noah and Preston talking in the study last night. They're planning to use your firm's client list for some kind of investment scheme. Something about leveraging your reputation to attract investors for the mill renovation." The floor seemed to tilt beneath me. The historic Blackwood mill, the source of the family's original fortune, had been shuttered for decades. Noah had mentioned vague plans to redevelop it into luxury condominiums, but I'd never agreed to involve my clients. "That's not possible," I said slowly. "Using my client information without consent would be illegal. Noah wouldn't risk my business, my reputation." Camille's expression was pitying. "The Blackwoods protect their own, Olivia. And despite what my brother may have led you to believe, that doesn't include you." Before I could respond, my phone buzzed. A text from my assistant. "Zoe, emergency at the office. Henderson account documents missing from secure server. Call ASAP." The timing couldn't be coincidental. The Henderson account, my largest client, had recently liquidated significant assets in preparation for a major investment opportunity I'd been developing for months. "I need to go," I told Camille, already dialing Zoe's number. "Family emergency." Camille caught my arm. "Be careful, Olivia. When Blackwoods feel threatened, they don't play fair." I nodded, mind racing as I maneuvered through clusters of laughing guests toward the exit. Noah intercepted me at the massive front doors, his handsome face arranged in an expression of concern that now felt calculated. "Leaving so soon, darling? Preston was just asking about your thoughts on some investment opportunities." I'm sure he was. I forced another smile, the kind I'd perfected in boardrooms when outmaneuvered but not yet defeated. "Client emergency. I need to handle it personally." Noah frowned. "Today? It's the family reunion. Appearances matter, Olivia." 3 years of marriage, and I'd never noticed how often he used my name. Like a teacher addressing a slightly slow student. Had his condescension always been there, or had I been willfully blind? "This client represents 30% of our EC annual revenue," I replied. "I think even your family would understand prioritizing 7 figures." His eyes flickered. Annoyance or guilt, I couldn't tell anymore. "Take my car," he said finally. "It's blocking yours in the driveway." The gesture would have seemed thoughtful once. Now I wondered if it was just another way to track my movements. The luxury sedan had a sophisticated GPS system that Noah monitored with his phone. "I'll call an Uber," I said, already walking down the grand entrance steps. "Enjoy the rest of the reunion." By the time I reached my office in downtown Providence, my shock had crystallized into something harder, colder, and more familiar. The strategic calculation that had built my business from a one-woman operation to one of Rhode Island's most respected financial advisory firms. Zoe was waiting, her usual composed demeanor rattled. "The Henderson files were accessed remotely using your credentials," she said without preamble. "I've already locked down the system and contacted cybersecurity." "Show me exactly what was accessed," I said, slipping off my heels and the persona of the perfect Blackwood wife simultaneously. The evidence was damning. Someone had systematically copied my most valuable client information. Not just Henderson, but my entire high-net-worth portfolio. Contact details, investment preferences, account balances. Everything needed to approach these clients with investment opportunities. The access point was traced to a device registered to Blackwood Enterprises, Zoe said quietly. My laugh held no humor. Of course it was. I pulled up the security footage for our office suite. The timestamp showed Noah entering late last night, using the key I'd given him for emergencies. The husband I trusted, moving through my professional space with the entitlement of someone who believed he had every right to take what wasn't his. "What should we do?" Zoe asked. The "we" warmed me slightly, a reminder that not everyone in my life saw me as a stepping stone. First, we secure what's left, change all passwords, implement the data breach protocol. I kicked into crisis management mode, the familiar rhythm of solving problems steadying me. Then notify the clients whose information was compromised. That's almost your entire client list, Zoe pointed out. If they lose confidence in our security, then I'll lose everything I've built, I finished. So we get ahead of it. Full transparency. We were specifically targeted in corporate espionage by Blackwood Enterprises. Zoe's eyes widened. You're going to publicly implicate your husband's family? I'm going to protect my clients and my business, I corrected. Noah made his choice. Now I'm making mine. As Zoe began implementing our security protocols, I closed my office door and allowed myself 5 minutes of pure, unadulterated rage. The calculated betrayal, the casual cruelty, the assumption that I would simply accept whatever scraps of respect the Blackwoods deigned to throw my way. 3 years of marriage. 3 years of trying to prove my worth to a family that had decided, before they ever met me, that I would never be enough. 3 years of watching Noah gradually transform from the man who had swept me off my feet into a perfect Blackwood clone, prioritizing family legacy over integrity. When my 5 minutes were up, I wiped away the tears I'd allowed myself and pulled up the one file I'd never expected to need. The detailed financial analysis of Blackwood Enterprises I'd conducted before marrying Noah. Call it professional curiosity or due diligence, but I'd wanted to understand the business empire that had shaped my husband. What I'd discovered then had been troubling: declining revenues, outdated business models, and a dangerous over-reliance on the company's historic reputation. But I'd also found something fascinating: the intricate web of loans and mortgages securing the Blackwood fortune, including the massive estate that had hosted today's reunion. I'd set the information aside then, choosing love and optimism over hard financial realities. Now I pulled up property records, loan documents, and bank statements with new purpose. The Blackwood family home, the crown jewel of their fading empire, was leveraged to the hilt, with a balloon payment coming due in 30 days. My phone buzzed again. Noah's face flashed on the screen. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to his message. "Olivia, darling, where are you? The family photo is in 20 minutes, and Preston is asking questions I can't answer. Call me back immediately." His voice held no genuine concern, just irritation at my failure to perform my assigned role. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I deleted the message and continued my research. A plan was forming, not just for damage control, but for something more definitive. If the Blackwoods thought they could use me and discard me, they had fundamentally misunderstood who they were dealing with. I pulled up the contact information for First Providence Bank, which held the primary mortgage on the Blackwood estate, and dialed a number I knew by heart. "Richard, it's Olivia Reed Blackwood. I need to discuss an investment opportunity. How quickly can you liquidate my personal portfolio?" By midnight, I had set the wheels in motion. My clients had been notified of the data breach with complete transparency. Blackwood Enterprises named explicitly as the source. Noah had called 17 times, each voicemail more desperate than the last, as the implications of my absence from the reunion and from our home began to dawn on him. I spent the night in my office, reviewing documents with Zoe and my newly retained legal counsel, Helen Park, one of Boston's most feared divorce attorneys. "The good news," Helen said as dawn broke over the Providence skyline, "is that your prenuptial agreement has a clear infidelity clause. Despite the Blackwood legal team's best efforts, they left that vulnerability intact." "Infidelity?" I questioned. "I'm not sure I can prove Noah's been unfaithful." Helen's smile was sharp. "Corporate infidelity counts. He used your access to steal client information. That's a breach of fiduciary duty and professional ethics. The clause is triggered." It was the first piece of good news in 24 hours. The prenup had been designed to protect the Blackwood assets from me in case of divorce. Now it would serve to protect my assets from them. And the mortgage. "Acquisition?" I asked. "First Providence Bank is prepared to sell the note to your investment group," Zoe confirmed. "The Blackwoods have missed 2 payments already. The bank is concerned about the balloon payment deadline." I nodded, reviewing the numbers one final time. I was about to invest nearly everything I had to purchase the mortgage on my in-laws' ancestral home. It was risky, financially and personally. But some things were worth the risk. "Do it," I said. My phone buzzed again. Noah, but this time with a text. "Where are you? Your clients are calling Preston, making accusations. We need to talk now." I didn't reply. Instead, I called Camille. "They're panicking," she reported without preamble. "Preston's locked himself in the study with the family lawyers. Noah's been pacing all night. Garrett's blaming you for everything, saying they should never have trusted an outsider." "Are you safe?" I asked. Despite everything, I cared for Camille, who had been caught in the middle of her family's machinations. "I'm staying with a friend," she assured me. "Olivia. Whatever you're planning, be thorough. Half measures won't work with them. Trust." "Me," I said. "Thoroughness is my specialty." The next morning, I arrived at my office to find Noah waiting in the reception area, unshaven and rumpled in yesterday's dress shirt. The perfect Blackwood image had cracked. "You need to stop this," he said, following me into my office without invitation. "Do you have any idea what you've done? The clients you've contacted are threatening to pull their investments. Preston is apoplectic." I set my bag down calmly. "Interesting that your first concern is for Preston's blood pressure, not the fact that you stole confidential information from your wife's business." "It wasn't stealing," Noah protested. "We're married. What's yours is mine. I was just leveraging resources for the family business." "Without my knowledge or consent," I said, "using my credentials to access secure client data." He ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "It was for us, Olivia. For our future. Once the mill redevelopment is funded, we'd be set for life." "No," I corrected. "The Blackwood family would be solvent again, with my client's money and my reputation as collateral." "Was that always the plan, Noah? Marry the successful financial advisor, use her connections, then push her aside once you'd taken what you needed?" His silence was damning. "Get out of my office," I said quietly. "My lawyer will contact you regarding divorce proceedings." Noah's handsome face contorted. "You can't divorce me. You signed agreements, confidentiality clauses. The Blackwood family doesn't get divorced." "Watch me." For the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. "What have you done?" I smiled, the same smile I'd worn when Garrett had called me worthless. At the reunion, a smile that no longer needed to hide pain. "I've made an investment," I said simply. "Now get out before I call security." 3 days later, the documents were finalized. My investment group, consisting of myself, Zoe, and 2 silent partners, now owned the mortgage on the Blackwood family estate. The balloon payment deadline was 27 days away, and based on my analysis of their finances, they couldn't possibly meet it. Noah's lawyer contacted me, offering a settlement. They would return all client information and issue a public apology in exchange for an extension on the mortgage. Through Helen, I declined. Garrett tried next, cornering me outside my office building with uncharacteristic humility. "This feud is between you and Noah," he pleaded. "The estate has been in our family for generations. You can't take it away out of spite." "Spite?" I echoed. "Is that what you call protecting myself from people who called me worthless to my face while plotting to steal my clients?" The following week, Preston Blackwood himself requested a meeting. I agreed to see him at my office on my terms. The once imposing family patriarch looked smaller somehow, diminished by the modern glass and steel of my conference room. Without the backdrop of his ancestral portraits and mahogany paneling, he was just an elderly man in an outdated suit. "Name your price," he said without preamble. "The estate has been in the Blackwood family since 1892. It's our heritage, our legacy." I studied him, remembering all the times he'd looked through me at family gatherings, as if I were a temporary inconvenience rather than his son's wife. "It's not about money," I said. "Then what? Revenge? I thought you were more practical than that." "I am practical," I confirmed. "I'm also a woman of principle. Your family tried to destroy everything I've built. You conspired to use my professional reputation for your benefit, with no regard for the ethical and legal implications. You treated me as disposable." Preston's face flushed. "We are the Blackwoods. This community was built on our contributions, our influence." "Your past contributions," I corrected. "Your former influence. The world has changed, Mr. Blackwood. The family name doesn't open the doors it once did. Your business practices are outdated, your finances are in shambles, and your only plan was to exploit my success to save yourselves. What do you want?" he asked again, an edge of desperation creeping into his voice. I slid a document across the table. "Full ownership of Blackwood Mill and the surrounding property transferred to my name. Noah signs an uncontested divorce agreement with a non-disclosure clause. A public statement acknowledging that Blackwood Enterprises attempted unauthorized access to Reed Financial's client data, and a 10-year ban on any Blackwood family member contacting my clients. Preston's hand trembled slightly as he reviewed the terms. This would effectively end Blackwood Enterprises. No, I countered. Your family's poor business decisions and ethical failures are ending Blackwood Enterprises. I'm simply declining to be your sacrifice. And if we agree to these outrageous terms, then I'll extend the mortgage deadline by 6 months, giving you time to find a buyer for the estate. I have no interest in becoming your landlord. Preston stood, his dignity reasserting itself. I'll need to discuss this with the family. You have 48 hours, I replied. After that, I'll begin foreclosure proceedings. The next day, Noah called. For the first time since our wedding, I let him go to voicemail. Olivia, his message began, voice raw with emotion that might have moved me once. I know I've hurt you. What I did was wrong, but please don't destroy my family's legacy to punish me. There must be another way forward. I deleted the message without responding and turned back to the spreadsheets covering my desk. The deeper I dug into Blackwood Enterprises' finances, the more troubled I became. This wasn't just about Noah's betrayal or Garrett's cruelty anymore. The company was a house of cards built on falsified valuations, deferred maintenance, and accounting tricks that bordered on fraud. You should see this, Zoe said, entering my office with a thick folder. Our forensic accountant found something interesting in the mill property records. The documents revealed what the Blackwoods had been hiding: environmental contamination from decades of textile manufacturing. Soil tests from 5 years ago showed dangerous levels of industrial chemicals, tests the family had buried rather than addressing. They were planning to develop luxury condominiums on contaminated land? I asked, horror replacing anger. Zoe nodded grimly. And use your client's money to fund it without disclosing the environmental issues. The revelation shifted something fundamental inside me. This wasn't just about my humiliation anymore. It was about protecting innocent people from a family, willing to risk others' health for their own gain. I called Helen immediately. We need to amend our demands. Full environmental testing of the mill property, with results reported to state authorities. They'll never agree to that, Helen cautioned. It could trigger regulatory actions, fines, mandatory remediation. Exactly, I replied. If they refuse, we go directly to the Environmental Protection Agency with what we've found. I was no longer just fighting for my dignity or my business. I was fighting to ensure the Blackwoods couldn't hurt anyone else with their desperate schemes. Camille arrived at my office later that afternoon, looking troubled. Is it true? She asked without preamble. About the contamination at the mill? Well, I gestured to the report spread across my desk. See for yourself. She skimmed the documents, her face paling. They told me the redevelopment was delayed because of zoning issues. Her eyes met mine. Olivia, there's a community garden less than a quarter-mile downstream from the mill. Kids play there. The information hardened my resolve. Your family has 48 hours to accept my terms, including full environmental disclosure and remediation planning. They won't do it, Camille said quietly. Especially not Garrett and Preston. They'd rather lose everything than admit they were wrong. Then they'll lose everything, I replied simply. I spent that evening in my downtown apartment. I hadn't returned to the home Noah and I shared since the reunion, developing a comprehensive strategy. If the Blackwoods refused my offer, I needed to be prepared for war. The deadline came and went. Preston's only response was a terse email from the family's attorney, dismissing my terms as extortionate and threatening countersuits for defamation. They were calling my bluff. Helen was ready. I've prepared the foreclosure papers. We can file first thing tomorrow. I hesitated, my pen hovering over the signature line. This action would irrevocably change lives, not just Noah's or Preston's, but everyone connected to the Blackwood name, the household staff who'd always been kind to me, the distant cousins who'd never been part of the inner circle's machinations. "Are you having second thoughts?" Helen asked. I thought about Garrett's sneer when he'd called me worthless, about Noah stealing from my business while pretending to love me, about Preston's willingness to risk public health to maintain appearances. "No," I said, signing my name with a firm hand. "I'm having clarity." The foreclosure filing made the local news by nightfall. Financial advisor forecloses on Blackwood estate, the Providence Journal headline read. Family feud threatens historic property. Noah arrived at my apartment unannounced, pounding on the door until I finally relented and let him in. He looked terrible, unshaven, eyes bloodshot, expensive clothing wrinkled. "You've lost your mind," he said, pacing my living room. "Do you understand what you've done? That house has been in my family for generations. And it would have remained in your family if you hadn't tried to steal from me," I replied calmly. "Actions have consequences, Noah." He stopped pacing, his expression shifting from anger to calculation. "What if I told you I made a mistake? That I still love you?" The words that might once have weakened my resolve now rang hollow. "Then I'd say you're desperate and lying." "We can fix this," he insisted. "I'll make a public apology. I'll give you full control of the mill redevelopment." "The contaminated mill that you were planning to build homes on?" I asked. "That you were going to use my client's money to finance without disclosing the environmental hazards?" He had the grace to look ashamed. "We would have addressed those issues eventually. After selling units to unsuspecting families? After my clients were financially committed?" I shook my head. "You're still not seeing the fundamental problem. Noah, this isn't just about betrayal, it's about who you've become, who your family has shaped you to be." "So this is punishment? Taking away our home to teach us a lesson?" "No," I said quietly. "This is protection. I'm protecting myself, my clients, and anyone else who might become collateral damage in your family's desperate attempt to maintain the illusion of success." Noah's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, his face hardening. "Preston wants to meet with both of us. Not interested." "He's prepared to negotiate," Noah pressed. "Seriously this time." I considered my options. Walking away would be satisfying, but hearing Preston's offer might reveal more about the family's financial situation, information that could be useful. "Fine. Tomorrow my office, 9 a.m. He comes alone without lawyers." Noah nodded, relief evident in the slight relaxation of his shoulders. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," I warned. "I'm not changing my terms." After he left, I called Zoe and Helen, briefing them on the upcoming meeting and requesting additional background research. If Preston was willing to negotiate now, something had changed. Something beyond the foreclosure filing. The answer came from Camille late that night. "The bank called in their other loans," she texted. "Not just the mortgage, everything." Preston's panicking. First Providence Bank's actions made strategic sense. If the Blackwoods couldn't pay the mortgage on their primary asset, other loans were likely also at risk. The bank was cutting its losses. Morning brought Preston Blackwood to my office, looking every inch the aging patriarch despite the circumstances. Noah arrived separately, standing awkwardly to the side as I directed Preston to a chair across from my desk. "You've made your point," Preston began without preamble. "Name your real price." "My terms haven't changed," I replied. "The mill property, uncontested divorce, public acknowledgement of the data theft, and a client non-contact agreement." Preston leaned forward. "Be reasonable, Olivia. The estate has been in our family for generations. We're prepared to pay a premium to resolve this situation." "With what money?" I asked bluntly. "Your company is over-leveraged. Your credit lines are maxed out. And the bank has called in your other loans. You don't have the resources to resolve anything." The direct reference to their financial troubles visibly startled both men. Noah looked at his uncle accusingly. "You said we had reserves." Preston waved a dismissive hand. "Temporary cash flow issues. Nothing unusual." "Your temporary cash flow issues have lasted 3 years," I noted. "Your last profitable quarter was in 2019, before the pandemic. Since then, you've been covering operational losses with increasingly desperate financing arrangements." "How could you possibly know that?" Preston demanded. I smiled thinly. "I'm a financial advisor, Mr. C. Blackwood. Analysis is what I do. And Noah conveniently used my office computer when he stole my client information, giving me access to his recent search history, including internal Blackwood financial reports." Noah paled. "Olivia, those documents are confidential." "So were my client files," I countered. "But here we are." Preston's jaw tightened. "What exactly are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts. Blackwood Enterprises is insolvent. You've been hiding it from shareholders, from the board, probably from most of your own family. The mill development wasn't just about maintaining the family legacy, it was your last desperate attempt to avoid bankruptcy." The silence that followed confirmed my assessment. Preston's weathered face seemed to age further before my eyes. "What do you want?" he asked again, his imperious tone replaced with something approaching defeat. I slid a revised agreement across the desk. "These are my final terms, non-negotiable." The document contained my original demands, plus additional requirements: full environmental disclosure to regulatory authorities, a remediation plan for the mill property, and a trust established to compensate any community members affected by contamination from Blackwood properties. "This would ruin us completely," Preston said after reviewing the terms. "Your actions have already done that," I replied. "I'm just ensuring you don't take innocent people down with you." Noah picked up the document, scanning it with the legal expertise that had once impressed me. The remediation costs alone could run into millions. "Which is why the agreement includes a structured payment plan based on Blackwood Enterprises' remaining assets," I explained. "I'm not unreasonable. I don't expect immediate payment for decades of environmental negligence." Preston stood abruptly. "I need to consult our attorneys." "You have 24 hours, I said. "After that, I'll proceed with the foreclosure and file environmental reports with state and federal authorities." After they left, Zoe entered with fresh coffee. "Think they'll agree?" "Preston won't," I predicted. "His pride won't allow it. But Noah might. And depending on the specific ownership structure of the estate, that could be enough." I spent the afternoon reviewing property records with Helen, confirming what I'd suspected. While the estate was considered family property, the actual ownership was divided among key members, with Noah holding a significant share as a direct descendant of the original builder. "If Noah signs independently," Helen confirmed, "it complicates their resistance significantly. They could still fight, but their position would be substantially weakened." My phone buzzed with a text from Camille. "Family meeting tonight. Preston's telling everyone it's your fault the bank called the loans. Garrett's suggesting legal action." I wasn't surprised. The Blackwoods' pattern was consistent. Blame others, fight rather than adapt, protect appearances at all costs. What did surprise me was Noah's call later that evening. "I want to meet," he said, his voice tight with strain. "Alone, not at your office." We agreed on neutral ground, a quiet table at an upscale restaurant downtown. Noah arrived looking haggard but determined, a leather portfolio tucked under his arm. "Before you say anything," he began after ordering a scotch, "I want you to know I've been doing a lot of thinking." "About how to save the family estate?" I asked. He shook his head. "About how we got here. About what I became when I chose family loyalty over everything else." It wasn't what I'd expected. Noah had always been the perfect Blackwood heir, pragmatic, strategic, focused on preserving the family's position regardless of cost. The environmental reports, he continued, I knew about them. Not just recently, 3 years ago, when the initial tests were done. I argued for disclosure and remediation, but Preston and the board overruled me. Said it would destroy investor confidence. Yet you stayed silent, I noted. Even knowing people could be harmed. Noah nodded, shame evident in his expression. I convinced myself it was temporary, that once we secured financing for redevelopment, we'd address the contamination properly. He laughed bitterly. I became exactly what I swore I never would. My father's son, putting family reputation above basic decency. His father, Preston's brother, had died when Noah was in college. I'd always sensed Noah's complicated feelings about him. Respect mingled with determination to forge a different path. What do you want, Noah? Why are we here? He opened the portfolio, sliding several documents across the table. I'm prepared to sign your agreement. All of it. The divorce, the property transfer, the public statement, everything. I studied him, looking for the trap. Why? What changed between this morning and now? I attended the family meeting Camille mentioned. Watched Preston and Garrett spin elaborate plans to fight you, to discredit you professionally, to do whatever necessary to preserve the Blackwood name. He took a long swallow of scotch. And I realized I didn't recognize myself anymore. That, somewhere along the way, I'd lost the principles that used to matter to me. It sounded sincere, but I'd believed in Noah's sincerity before. Your signature alone won't be enough. Preston will fight this. My signature, combined with Camille's, and my cousin Thomas's, establishes controlling interest in the estate, Noah countered. I've already spoken to them both. Thomas was shocked about the contamination issues. He has young children, lives less than a mile from the mill. And Camille. He smiled sadly. Camille has always seen more clearly than the rest of us. I examined the documents more carefully. Noah was right. With these 3 signatures, the agreement would be legally binding regardless of Preston's objections. Why would you do this? You're giving up everything. Your inheritance, your position in the family. Noah met my gaze directly. Because you were right. About all of it. The Blackwoods have been living on borrowed time and borrowed money, sacrificing ethics for appearances. When Garrett called you worthless at the reunion, no one challenged him, including me. That silence spoke volumes about what we've become. I wanted to believe him. Part of me, the part that had fallen in love with Noah before the Blackwood influence had fully claimed him, desperately wanted this apparent awakening to be genuine. If you're sincere, I said carefully, you should know that signing these documents means more than losing the estate. Preston will likely cut you out completely. The family businesses, your position at the firm. I know, Noah replied simply, and I'm prepared for that. Some prices are worth paying to reclaim. Your integrity. We spent the next hour reviewing the documents, Noah signing each one without hesitation. When it was done, he looked both exhausted and oddly peaceful. I am sorry, Olivia, he said quietly. Not just for the betrayal, but for failing to be the man you thought you married, the man I thought I was. I accepted his apology with a nod, uncertain what else to say. This unexpected turn had left me off balance, my carefully constructed anger suddenly lacking a clear target. What will you do now? I asked finally. Start over, he said with a slight shrug. My law degree is still valid even without the Blackwood name opening doors. Maybe focus on environmental law, a small attempt at karmic balance. As we prepared to leave, Noah hesitated. For what it's worth, you were never worthless. You were the most valuable person in any Blackwood. Not for what you could provide, but for who you are. I'm sorry I forgot that. I watched him walk away, my emotions more complicated than I'd anticipated. When I'd begun this process, I'd wanted revenge against everyone bearing the Blackwood name. Now, I wasn't sure what I wanted beyond ensuring justice was served and harm was prevented. Back in my apartment, I reviewed the signed documents. With these, Helen could proceed immediately, transferring the mill property, filing the divorce agreement, initiating the environmental remediation process. The Blackwood estate would be granted the 6-month extension I'd promised, giving the family time to relocate with dignity despite their resistance. My phone rang. Camille. I just heard from Noah, she said without preamble. I assume you have the papers? Yes. Are you certain about this? The consequences for you are long overdue, she interrupted. The Blackwood way of doing business has been toxic for generations. This isn't just about Noah's betrayal or Garrett's cruelty. It's about breaking a cycle that should have ended decades ago. Her conviction resonated with my own evolving perspective. What will you do? After. I've been offered a position at a gallery in New York, she replied. Been sitting on it for months, afraid to leave the family orbit. Not anymore. After we hung up, I sat at my window overlooking downtown Providence, the city lights glimmering against the night sky. Tomorrow, the legal machinery would begin turning. The foreclosure would proceed with the extended timeline. The environmental authorities would receive comprehensive documentation of the mill contamination. The Blackwood name would be associated with scandal rather than prestige. It wasn't the pure revenge I'd initially envisioned. Some family members, Noah, Camille, Thomas, had chosen accountability over blind loyalty. Others, Preston, Garrett, would likely never acknowledge their role in the family's downfall. The truth was messier than fiction. Justice, I was learning, rarely arrived in perfect packages. My phone buzzed with a news alert. Blackwood heir resigns from family business, cites ethical concerns. Noah had wasted no time making his position public. The article quoted him directly. The Blackwood legacy should be defined by integrity, not appearances. I can no longer be part of business practices that prioritize family pride over ethical responsibility. Preston's response was equally direct. Noah Blackwood no longer represents the family in any capacity. His statements reflect personal views, not those of Blackwood Enterprises. The battle lines were drawn, and they no longer ran neatly between the Blackwoods and me. Instead, the family itself was fracturing along moral lines that had perhaps always existed beneath the surface of unity they presented to the world. I forwarded the article to Helen with a brief message. Proceed as planned. The next morning brought another unexpected visitor, Garrett, looking considerably less arrogant than he had at the family reunion. 5 minutes, I said reluctantly, gesturing him into my office. Unlike Noah's apparent soul-searching, Garrett's approach was purely transactional. I understand you now control the estate mortgage, he began without preamble. That's correct. I want to make a private arrangement. My portion of the property includes the gatehouse, much smaller than the main residence, separately deeded. I'm prepared to buy out that portion directly. The request was surprising. The gatehouse, while charming, was hardly the symbol of prestige Garrett had always seemed to covet. Why would you want the gatehouse specifically? I asked. He shifted uncomfortably. My grandmother lived there before she died. She raised me after my parents' divorce. It's important to me. This glimpse of actual sentiment from Garrett was unexpected. I was under the impression nothing mattered to you except the Blackwood name and fortune. There's a difference between family legacy and family home, he replied stiffly. I've secured independent financing, no connection to Blackwood Enterprises or Preston. I studied him, noting the uncharacteristic vulnerability beneath his usual arrogance. I'll have my attorney review the deed segmentation. If it's legally feasible without complicating the main property disposition, I'll consider it. After he left, I wondered how many other complexities I'd discover as this process unfolded, how many dimensions to the Blackwoods I'd overlooked in my initial anger. By evening, Helen had confirmed the gatehouse could indeed be separately handled without affecting the main foreclosure process. But are you sure you want to accommodate Garrett? He's been the most openly hostile towards you. I'm not doing it for him, I replied after consideration. I'm doing it because it's the right thing. This isn't about punishing everyone with the Blackwood name. It's about justice and prevention of harm. The distinction felt important. My initial motivation had been raw hurt transformed into a desire for revenge. Somewhere along the way, it had evolved into something more nuanced, a determination to hold people accountable while still recognizing their humanity. I instructed Helen to draw up the gatehouse agreement with strict conditions. Garrett would need to publicly acknowledge the data theft and support the environmental remediation efforts. His purchase would be conditional on those terms. He'll never agree, Helen predicted. To my surprise, he did, reluctantly with considerable legal negotiation, but ultimately accepting that accountability was the price of preserving his personal connection to the property. The news cycle moved quickly. Within days, the story had expanded beyond a family dispute to encompass the environmental issues, the potential financial misconduct at Blackwood Enterprises, and the fracturing of one of Rhode Island's oldest families. I received calls from journalists seeking comment, which I declined. This wasn't about public humiliation anymore. It was about resolution. The foreclosure would proceed, the mill property would be remediated, my business would recover, and I would rebuild my life without the Blackwood shadow looming over me. Preston made one final attempt at negotiation, offering a substantial cash settlement in exchange for discretion regarding family matters. Through Helen, I declined. The time for discretion was before the data theft, before the planned exploitation of my clients, before the dismissal of environmental hazards. I instructed her to tell him. Accountability isn't negotiable. As Preston left Helen's office, after receiving my response, he reportedly said, "She'll regret making an enemy of the Blackwoods. Some families don't forget." If the comment was meant to intimidate me, it failed. I'd seen behind the Blackwood curtain now. The power they projected was largely illusion, maintained through strategic marriages, old connections, and a willingness to sacrifice ethics for appearances. 1 month after the family reunion where Garrett had called me worthless, I stood on the grounds of the mill property, now legally mine as part of the settlement. Environmental engineers moved across the site, conducting comprehensive testing to determine the full extent of contamination. The remediation would be expensive and time-consuming, but necessary before any development could proceed. I had no interest in building luxury condominiums as the Blackwoods had planned. Instead, I was exploring partnerships with the city for mixed-income housing combined with green space, a development that would benefit the community rather than exploit it. My phone buzzed with a text from Camille. "Moving to NYC tomorrow. Thank you for everything. Some endings are really beginnings." I smiled at the sentiment, finding unexpected resonance in it. When I'd discovered Noah's betrayal and faced Garrett's cruelty, I'd seen only the ending of my marriage, of my illusions, of my patience with the Blackwood arrogance. Now I recognized the beginning that had emerged from that painful ending. My business was recovering, strengthened by my transparent handling of the data breach. I was developing new professional relationships based on mutual respect rather than exploitation. I was even finding unexpected allies among former Blackwoods who had chosen integrity over family loyalty. I hadn't just foreclosed on a house, I'd foreclosed on a way of doing business, on a value system that prioritized appearance over substance. In the process, I'd reclaimed my own worth, defined not by marriage or connection to an old family name, but by my actions and principles. Preston had been wrong at our final meeting. This wasn't about destroying a family legacy. It was about insisting that legacy be truthful, ethical, and accountable. Some of the Blackwoods had risen to that challenge, others had not. The distinction mattered. As I watched the engineers work, I felt no triumph or vindication, just quiet certainty that I had done what was necessary. Not just for myself, but for everyone who might have been harmed by the Blackwoods' desperate attempts to maintain their fading glory. Garrett's words at the reunion seemed distant now, stripped of their power to wound. I wasn't worthless. I'd never been worthless. And in forcing this reckoning, I'd proven that worth isn't determined by those who would diminish you, but by your own willingness to stand firm for what matters. The foreclosure was proceeding. The generational home would change hands. But the true victory wasn't in taking something from the Blackwoods. It was in refusing to let them take anything more from me. 6 months after the family reunion where Garrett had called me worthless, I stood on the sweeping front lawn of the Blackwood estate, watching as the moving trucks pulled away. The foreclosure process had finally concluded, despite Preston's multiple legal challenges and delay tactics. The 6-month extension I'd granted had given the family time to remove their personal belongings with dignity, an offer some had appreciated and others had seen as a final insult. The grand Victorian mansion stood empty now, its windows reflecting the afternoon sunlight, its ornate facade in need of repairs that the Blackwoods had deferred for years while maintaining the illusion of prosperity. My real estate agent had already received interest from several hospitality groups looking to convert the property into a boutique hotel or event venue. Whatever its future, the house would no longer be a prison of expectations and pretense. Ms. Reed? The voice belonged to Florence, the Blackwoods' longtime housekeeper, who had surprised everyone by choosing to stay until the final day. The last of the family portraits have been packed. The movers took them to Mr. Preston's new condominium. I nodded my thanks. How are you doing with all this, Florence? The older woman considered the question carefully. Change comes to everything eventually, she said diplomatically, even to places that seem permanent. Will you be all right? I know this has affected your livelihood. Florence's smile was unexpectedly warm. Miss Camille arranged a position for me with her in New York. I start next week. This news pleased me. Camille had followed through on her gallery job, establishing herself independently of the family legacy. She'd been the only Blackwood to maintain contact with me throughout the legal proceedings, providing quiet support and occasional insider information that had proven invaluable. I'm glad to hear it, I replied sincerely. As Florence departed, I took one final walk through the empty rooms of the mansion that had so intimidated me during my 3 years of marriage. Without the imposing Blackwood furniture and ancestral portraits, the house revealed its age and vulnerability. Water stains on ceilings, cracks in plaster, the unmistakable signs of long-deferred maintenance hidden behind strategic furniture, placement and carefully hung artwork. Like the family itself, the house had projected grandeur while concealing decay. Now both stood exposed, their carefully maintained facades stripped away. My phone buzzed, a text from Helen. Final paperwork filed. Mill Property Environmental Remediation Plan approved by EPA. Congratulations. The mill property had become my primary focus once the foreclosure was secured. Working with environmental engineers and state authorities, I'd developed a comprehensive plan to address the decades of industrial contamination. The cost was substantial, but I'd secured partners who shared my vision of transformation, converting the contaminated industrial site into a mixed-use development with affordable housing, green space, and community facilities. Noah had surprised me by offering his legal expertise pro bono to navigate the complex regulatory requirements, working alongside my team rather than against us. His assistance had been valuable, his expertise in environmental law growing as he distanced himself from the Blackwood Empire. The East Wing Foundation needs significant work, noted Thomas Blackwood, Noah's cousin, who had joined me in this final walkthrough as part of his new role with the Historical Preservation Commission. The previous structural assessment was optimistically misleading. I wasn't surprised. Preston's pattern of concealing uncomfortable truths extended to every aspect of the family's holdings. The new owners will need to know. I want full transparency about the condition of the property. Thomas nodded approvingly. Quite different from the Blackwood approach. That's rather the point, I replied. Following the initial confrontation, the Blackwood family had splintered along lines that had likely existed beneath the surface for generations. Preston, Garrett, and their immediate allies had retreated into bitter opposition, filing lawsuits that were subsequently dismissed and attempting to turn community opinion against me as an outsider, destroying a historical legacy. Others, like Thomas, Camille, and eventually Noah, had chosen a different path, acknowledging the family's ethical failures and working to rebuild their professional and personal lives on foundations of transparency and accountability. The division had played out publicly, with Preston giving increasingly unhinged interviews to local media, while Camille and Noah established new ventures explicitly designed to address past wrongs. The community's response had been mixed, but increasingly favorable to those Blackwoods who had chosen reformation over denial. As Thomas and I completed our inspection of the property, a sleek black car pulled up the long driveway. Noah emerged, looking markedly different from the polished Blackwood heir I'd married. His expensive suits had been replaced by more casual attire, his previously perfect haircut slightly grown out. The transformation wasn't just physical. There was an ease to his movements that I hadn't seen in years, as if shedding the Blackwood expectations had literally lightened his burden. "I thought I might find you here," he said, approaching us on the wide front porch. "Saying goodbye?" "More like confirming what's being transferred to the new owners," I replied, keeping my tone professional. Our divorce had been finalized 3 months ago, the proceedings remarkably straightforward once Noah had committed to the agreement we'd negotiated. Thomas excused himself tactfully, heading back to his car with clipboard in hand. "I heard the environmental permits for the mill development came through," Noah said, leaning against the porch railing. "Congratulations. That's a significant achievement considering the complexity of the site." "The remediation team starts next week," I confirmed. The contamination was even more extensive than the initial tests suggested, but containment is possible with the right approach. Noah nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I've been following similar cases in Massachusetts. There's precedent for successful transformation of industrial sites, even with this level of chemical exposure." We stood in silence for a moment, the gap between us filled with the complex history that had brought us to this point. I'd expected to feel triumph standing here as the Blackwood era at this property concluded. Instead, I felt something closer to resolution, a chapter closing, a lesson learned, a path redirected. "I'm moving to Boston next month," Noah said finally, taking a position with an environmental law firm that specializes in corporate accountability cases. The irony wasn't lost on either of us, from defending corporations to holding them accountable, I observed. "Quite a journey." He smiled slightly. "Sometimes you need to lose everything to understand what matters." His eyes met mine directly. "I know we can't undo what happened between us, but I wanted you to know that forcing this reckoning was necessary for all of us." It was perhaps the most honest acknowledgement I'd ever received from him. "I didn't do it for the Blackwoods," I reminded him. "I did it to protect myself and my clients." "I know, but the consequences have been clarifying. For those of us willing to see clearly." He gestured toward the house. "This place wasn't just a home. It was a symbol of obligation, of expectations that warped generation after generation. Maybe its ending is actually a kind of freedom." Before I could respond, my phone rang. Zoe with updates about a new client relationship that required immediate attention. "I need to take this," I said, stepping away. Noah nodded, understanding. "Of course. I just wanted to say thank you. Not for anything specific, just in general." As I dealt with my business matter, Noah walked the perimeter of the house one last time, his hands in his pockets, his gaze occasionally lifting to the ornate cornices and gables of his childhood home. When I finished my call, he was already heading back to his car. I watched him leave, reflecting on the strange journey that had brought us to this moment. 6 months ago, I'd wanted to destroy the Blackwoods for what they'd done to me. Now, I recognized that what had actually happened was more nuanced. The confrontation had accelerated a reckoning that was perhaps inevitable. Given the family's increasingly desperate financial maneuvers and ethical compromises, some, like Preston and Garrett, had chosen to double down on denial and blame. Others had chosen to rebuild on more solid foundations. And I had reclaimed my power, my business, and my future. As I prepared to leave the property for the final time, Florence reappeared, carrying a small package wrapped in cloth. "I found this in the library during the final cleaning," she said, holding it out to me. "It seemed important that you have it." Unwrapping the bundle, I found a small leather journal, its cover worn with age. Opening it revealed elegant handwriting dated 1925, the journal of Eleanor Blackwood, Preston's grandmother and the family matriarch during the Great Depression. Scanning the first few pages, I was struck by her candid assessment of the family's financial troubles during that era, her private concerns about her husband's business practices, and her determination to preserve both the family legacy and her own integrity through difficult times. "She was different from the rest," Florence said quietly. "Strong-minded, not always appreciated for it in her time. But she kept the family afloat when the mills were failing. The men don't like to acknowledge how much they owe her." I thanked Florence for the unexpected gift, tucking the journal into my bag. As I drove away from the Blackwood estate for the final time, I felt a curious connection to this woman I'd never met, another outsider who had challenged a family's comfortable illusions when circumstances demanded it. 2 weeks later, I was reviewing final designs for the mill property redevelopment when my assistant announced an unexpected visitor, Garrett Blackwood. He entered my office looking considerably diminished from the arrogant figure who had called me worthless at the family reunion. His designer clothing had been replaced by more modest attire, his swagger by a tentative demeanor that seemed foreign on him. "Thank you for seeing me," he began stiffly, declining my offer to sit. "I wanted to inform you personally that the gatehouse renovation is complete. As per our agreement, the environmental testing has been conducted and remediation completed where necessary." The gatehouse arrangement had been one of the more surprising outcomes of the Blackwood reckoning. Garrett had fought to retain this small piece of the family property, eventually agreeing to my stringent conditions, including a public apology for his role in the data theft and full cooperation with environmental authorities. "I've received the certification," I confirmed. "The property transfer should be finalized next week." He nodded, his usual combative energy notably absent. "I also wanted to say—" He hesitated, clearly struggling with the words. "Your handling of this situation has been fair, more than fair, given what I said to you, what we tried to do to you." Coming from Garrett, this awkward acknowledgement was unexpected. "I appreciate that," I replied neutrally. He shifted, uncomfortably. "Noah's decision to support your position. It forced many of us to reconsider some assumptions about family loyalty, about what's acceptable." I studied him, trying to determine if this apparent transformation was genuine, or simply another Blackwood performance. "And what conclusions have you reached?" "That Preston's leadership has been problematic. that what happened with your client data was indefensible. He met my gaze directly. And that calling you worthless was not just cruel, but demonstrably false. You've proven your worth quite definitively. The admission seemed to cost him considerably. Garrett had always been the most vocally loyal to Preston, the most invested in the family's perceived superiority. This acknowledgement represented a significant shift. "What will you do now?" I asked, genuinely curious. "With Blackwood Enterprises essentially dissolved?" "I've accepted a position with a marketing firm in Boston," he replied, "starting at the bottom. No family connections, no shortcuts. Just work." He smiled ruefully. Novel concept for a Blackwood. After he left, I found myself returning to Eleanor Blackwood's journal, reading her account of guiding her family through their previous financial collapse. Her words resonated across nearly a century. "A family name is not an achievement, but a responsibility. When we forget this, we invite disaster." The Blackwoods had forgotten this fundamental truth, believing their name entitled them to success rather than obligating them to earn it. Now they were learning otherwise, some more gracefully than others. Preston remained the notable exception to this pattern of recognition and adaptation. His response to the foreclosure had been increasingly erratic, culminating in a rambling interview with the Providence Journal in which he accused me of orchestrating a vindictive campaign against one of Rhode Island's most distinguished families. The community's response had been telling. Rather than rallying around Preston's defensive tradition, many had expressed support for the planned transformation of the mill property, recognizing the potential benefits of environmental remediation and affordable housing development in a region struggling with both contamination and housing shortages. Camille called that evening from New York, where her gallery was preparing for its first major exhibition. "Have you seen the latest?" she asked without preamble. "Preston's interview? Yes. It's unfortunate." "Not just that," she said. "He's formed a heritage preservation group to oppose the mill development, claiming it erases important industrial history." I sighed, unsurprised by this latest maneuver. The mill has been abandoned for decades. His sudden concern for its historical significance is transparently self-serving. "Of course it is," Camille agreed. "But he's gathering support from certain circles, old money, families who see themselves in the Blackwoods' fall and fear they could be next." This development was concerning, but not unexpected. Change threatened. Those who benefited from existing power structures, and Providence had its share of families clinging to fading influence, much like the Blackwoods. "We'll address it through proper channels," I assured her. "The development plan includes preservation of historically significant elements. We've worked closely with architectural historians to ensure that." After we hung up, I reviewed the latest financial projections for Reed Financial. The firm had not only survived the crisis precipitated by Noah's data theft, but emerged stronger, our transparent handling of the breach and subsequent legal action earning us a reputation for integrity that had attracted new clients. The irony wasn't lost on me. The Blackwoods' attempt to exploit my business had ultimately strengthened it. My refusal to be diminished by their actions had transformed potential catastrophe into opportunity. The following morning brought news that Preston's opposition group had filed formal objections to the mill redevelopment permits, citing historical preservation concerns. It was a delaying tactic, nothing more, but one that would require careful response. I met with my development team and legal advisors, including Noah, who had become an unexpected ally in navigating these challenges. Preston's built his entire identity on the Blackwood legacy, Noah explained as we reviewed the objection documents. Without it, he has no framework for understanding himself or his place in the world. He'll fight this to his last breath because he can't conceive of value beyond the family name. "While you can?" I asked, curious about his perspective. Noah considered the question thoughtfully. I'm learning to. It's uncomfortable. Redefining yourself after 3 decades of being told exactly who you are and what matters. He smiled, slightly, but also liberating. We developed a comprehensive response to Preston's objections, incorporating additional historical preservation elements while maintaining the core mission of remediation and community benefit. The process would take time, but the legal foundation of our plan was solid. As the meeting concluded, Noah lingered. I've been reading about the original mill workers, he said. The conditions they endured, the health impacts they suffered, without compensation or acknowledgement. All while my ancestors built their fortune. I nodded, having uncovered similar historical accounts during my research. The contamination we're addressing isn't just chemical, it's historical. A pattern of exploitation that needs acknowledgement as much as remediation. Exactly, Noah agreed. Which is why I've started a historical documentation project, collecting testimonies from former workers and their descendants, creating a proper record of both the achievements and the costs of the Blackwood industrial era. This initiative surprised me. That's actually quite meaningful. It's the least I can do, he replied simply. Accountability isn't just about legal settlements, it's about truth-telling. As Noah left, I reflected on the unexpected paths this confrontation had created. When Garrett had called me worthless at the family reunion, he had unknowingly initiated a process that would not only challenge the Blackwood family's place in the community, but also force a reckoning with their historical impact, both positive and negative. The foreclosure of the family home had become more than a financial transaction or personal vindication. It had become a catalyst for broader examination of legacy, responsibility, and restitution. That evening, I met with community representatives from neighborhoods surrounding the mill property, listening to their concerns and priorities for the redevelopment. These were families who had lived for generations in the shadow of Blackwood industry, their health and prosperity affected by decisions made in the grand mansion I had recently foreclosed upon. We've been told for years that nothing could be done about the contamination, explained Maria Santos, whose grandmother had worked at the mill before its closure. That testing would be too expensive, remediation impossible, yet suddenly it's happening. Why now when it couldn't happen before? Because now there's someone willing to prioritize it, I replied honestly. To invest in doing what's right rather than what's easy or profitable. The meeting extended late into the evening, the community members sharing stories, concerns, and hopes for the transformed property. I listened more than I spoke, recognizing that my role was not to impose a vision, but to facilitate one that served those most affected by the Blackwood legacy of environmental negligence. As I drove home afterward, I found myself thinking about Eleanor Blackwood's journal entries from the 1930s, particularly her observations about the relationship between the family and the community that sustained it. We speak of giving back, as if the wealth were ours alone to begin with, rather than created through the labor and loyalty of thousands whose names will never adorn a building. She had understood something fundamental that her descendants had forgotten, that wealth creation is inherently collaborative, dependent on community support and labor. That responsibility flows from this reality, not despite it. 3 days. Later, Preston escalated his opposition, calling a press conference on the steps of Providence City Hall. Surrounded by a small group of supporters, he denounced the mill redevelopment as erasure of Rhode Island's industrial heritage, and me, personally as an opportunist exploiting a family's temporary financial difficulties. The performance might once have carried weight in a community accustomed to deferring to Blackwood pronouncements. Now it seemed desperately out of touch, particularly when contrasted with the community engagement sessions that had been documenting real concerns and hopes for the property's future. Most telling was the absence of other Blackwood family members from Preston's press conference. Even Garrett, once his most reliable ally, had distanced himself from this latest crusade, focusing instead on his new career and the gatehouse renovation. The local media coverage reflected this shift in perception. The Providence Journal's analysis noted that Preston's characterization of temporary financial difficulties contradicted documented evidence of long-term mismanagement and deliberate concealment of environmental liabilities. Several reporters directly questioned the sincerity of his sudden concern for industrial heritage, given the decades of Blackwood neglect of the property. Noah called after watching the coverage, "This is the death throes of the old Blackwood approach," he observed, making pronouncements rather than addressing problems, expecting deference rather than earning respect. "It's still creating complications for the project," I noted. "Short term, yes," he acknowledged, "but it's also highlighting exactly why the project is necessary." Preston doesn't realize he's becoming the perfect negative example, the embodiment of outdated privilege resisting necessary change. That evening, I received an unexpected email from Vanessa, Garrett's girlfriend, who had laughed when he called me worthless at the reunion. She was reaching out to apologize for her role in the family's treatment of me, explaining that she had recently ended her relationship with Garrett as part of her own reassessment of values. "Being associated with the Blackwood name once seemed like achieving something significant," she wrote. "Now I understand that true significance comes from what you build, not what you inherit or marry into. Your response to their treatment of you has been a powerful example of dignity and principle." The message was unexpected, but reflected a broader pattern I'd observed. The Blackwood reckoning had triggered reconsideration far beyond the immediate family, affecting those in their social and professional circles who had enabled or benefited from their approach. 6 weeks after Preston's press conference, the City Zoning Board unanimously approved our revised mill redevelopment plan, which incorporated enhanced historical preservation elements while maintaining the core commitment to environmental remediation and affordable housing. The decision effectively neutralized Preston's primary objection strategy, though I had no doubt he would seek other avenues to obstruct the project. What I hadn't anticipated was Camille's next move. She called the day after the zoning approval, her voice animated with unusual excitement. "I'm curating an exhibition," she announced, "about New England's industrial legacy, the innovations, the labor movements, the environmental impacts. I want to center it around the Blackwood mills specifically, telling the complete story for the first time." The proposal was bold, a direct challenge to Preston's selective historical narrative. "He'll see it as another betrayal," I cautioned. "Probably," she agreed. "But it's not about him. It's about acknowledging the full reality of our family's impact, both the achievements and the harm." The exhibition will include oral histories from workers, environmental data, and previously unseen company documents that Noah found in the estate before the foreclosure. Documents? Internal memos from the 1970s confirming management knew about chemical contamination issues but chose not to address them, she explained. Health complaints from workers that were systematically dismissed. The real history, not the sanitized version. The initiative aligned perfectly with Noah's historical documentation project and the community engagement work I'd been doing around the mill redevelopment. Together, they represented a comprehensive approach to accountability: legal, financial, historical, and cultural. "Will you participate?" Camille asked. "Your perspective is essential to the complete story." I hesitated, still uncomfortable with public attention. My goal had never been to position myself as the protagonist in the Blackwood narrative, but rather to protect myself and others from the consequences of their actions. "Think about it," she urged when I didn't immediately respond. "This isn't about revenge or public shaming. It's about honest reckoning with history so that real healing and progress can happen." After we hung up, I returned to Eleanor Blackwood's journal, finding unexpected guidance in her reflections from nearly a century ago. True legacy is not in buildings or bank accounts, but in the impact we have on lives around us. When that impact has been harmful, acknowledgement is not weakness, but the only path to redemption. Perhaps participation in Camille's exhibition was another form of the accountability I'd been seeking all along. Not just financial or legal, but historical and ethical. Not just for the current generation of Blackwoods, but for the entire legacy they represented. I am practical, I confirmed. I'm also a woman of principle. Your family tried to destroy everything I've built. You conspired to use my professional reputation for your benefit, with no regard for the ethical and legal implications. You treated me as disposable. Preston's face flushed. We are the Blackwoods. This community was built on our contributions, our influence. Your past contributions, I corrected. Your former influence. The world has changed, Mr. Blackwood. The family name doesn't open the doors it once did. Your business practices are outdated, your finances are in shambles, and your only plan was to exploit my success to save yourselves. What do you want? He asked again, an edge of desperation creeping into his voice. I slid a document across the table. Full ownership of Blackwood Mill and the surrounding property transferred to my name. Noah signs an uncontested divorce agreement with a non-disclosure clause. A public statement acknowledging that Blackwood Enterprises attempted unauthorized access to Reed Financial's client data. And a 10-year ban on any Blackwood family member contacting my clients. Preston's hand trembled slightly as he reviewed the terms. This would effectively end Blackwood Enterprises. No, I countered. Your family's poor business decisions and ethical failures are ending Blackwood Enterprises. I'm simply declining to be your sacrifice. And if we agree to these outrageous terms, then I'll extend the mortgage deadline by 6 months, giving you time to find a buyer for the estate. I have no interest in becoming your landlord. Preston stood, his dignity reasserting itself. I'll need to discuss this with the family. You have 48 hours, I replied. After that, I'll begin foreclosure proceedings. I studied him, trying to determine if this apparent transformation was genuine or simply another Blackwood performance. And what conclusions have you reached? That Preston's leadership has been problematic. That what happened with your client, data was indefensible. He met my gaze directly. And that calling you worthless was not just cruel, but demonstrably false. You've proven your worth quite definitively. The admission seemed to cost him considerably. Garrett had always been the most vocally loyal to Preston, the most invested in the family's perceived superiority. This acknowledgement represented a significant shift. What will you do now? I asked, genuinely curious. With Blackwood Enterprises essentially dissolved? I've accepted a position with a marketing firm in Boston, he replied. Starting at the bottom. No family connections, no shortcuts, just work. He smiled ruefully. Novel concept for a Blackwood. After he left, I found myself returning to Eleanor Blackwood's journal, reading her account of guiding her family through their previous financial collapse. Her words resonated across nearly a century. A family name is not an achievement, but a responsibility. When we forget this, we invite disaster. The Blackwoods had forgotten this fundamental truth, believing their name entitled them to success rather than obligating them to earn it. Now they were learning otherwise, some more gracefully than others. Preston remained the notable exception to this pattern of recognition and adaptation. His response to the foreclosure had been increasingly erratic, culminating in a rambling interview with the Providence Journal in which he accused me of orchestrating a vindictive campaign against one of Rhode Island's most distinguished families. The community's response had been telling. Rather than rallying around Preston's defense of tradition, many had expressed support for the planned transformation of the mill property. recognizing the potential benefits of environmental remediation and affordable housing development in a region struggling with both contamination and housing shortages. Camille called that evening from New York, where her gallery was preparing for its first major exhibition. "Have you seen the latest?" she asked without preamble. "Preston's interview? Yes, it's unfortunate." "Not just that," she said. "He's formed a heritage preservation group to oppose the mill development, claiming it erases important industrial history." I sighed, unsurprised by this latest maneuver. The mill has been abandoned for decades. His sudden concern for its historical significance is transparently self-serving. "Of course it is," Camille agreed. "But he's gathering support from certain circles. Old money. Families who see themselves in the Blackwoods' fall and fear they could be next." This development was concerning but not unexpected. Change threatened those who benefited from existing power structures, and Providence had its share of families clinging to fading influence, much like the Blackwoods. "We'll address it through proper channels," I assured her. "The development plan includes preservation of historically significant elements. We've worked closely with architectural historians to ensure that." After we hung up, I reviewed the latest financial projections for Reed Financial. The firm had not only survived the crisis precipitated by Noah's data theft, but emerged stronger, our transparent handling of the breach and subsequent legal action earning us a reputation for integrity that had attracted new clients. The irony wasn't lost on me. The Blackwoods' attempt to exploit my business had ultimately strengthened it. My refusal to be diminished by their actions had transformed potential catastrophe into opportunity. The following morning brought news that Preston's opposition group had filed formal objections to the mill redevelopment permits, citing historical preservation concerns. It was a delaying tactic, nothing more, but one that would require careful response. I met with my development team and legal advisors, including Noah, who had become an unexpected ally in navigating these challenges. Preston's built his entire identity on the Blackwood legacy, Noah explained as we reviewed the objection documents. Without it, he has no framework for understanding himself or his place in the world. He'll fight this to his last breath because he can't conceive of value beyond the family name. "While you can?" I asked, curious about his perspective. Noah considered the question thoughtfully. "I'm learning to. It's uncomfortable. Redefining yourself after 3 decades of being told exactly who you are and what matters." He smiled slightly, but also liberating. We developed a comprehensive response to Preston's objections, incorporating additional historical preservation elements while maintaining the core mission of remediation and community benefit. The process would take time, but the legal foundation of our plan was solid. As the meeting concluded, Noah lingered. "I've been reading about the original mill workers," he said. "The conditions they endured, the health impacts they suffered, without compensation or acknowledgement, all while my ancestors built their fortune." I nodded, having uncovered similar historical accounts during my research. The contamination we're addressing isn't just chemical, it's historical. A pattern of exploitation that needs acknowledgement as much as remediation. "Exactly," Noah agreed. "Which is why I've started a historical documentation project, collecting testimonies from former workers and their descendants, creating a proper record of both the achievements and the costs of the Blackwood industrial era." This initiative surprised me. That's actually quite meaningful. "It's the least I can do," he replied simply. "Accountability isn't just about legal settlements, it's about truth-telling." As Noah left, I reflected on the unexpected paths this confrontation had created. When Garrett had called me worthless at the family reunion, he had unknowingly initiated a process that would not only challenge the Blackwood family's place in the community, but also force a reckoning with their historical impact, both positive and negative. The foreclosure of the family home had become more than a financial transaction or personal vindication. It had become a catalyst for broader examination of legacy, responsibility, and restitution. That evening, I met with community representatives from neighborhoods surrounding the mill property, listening to their concerns and priorities for the redevelopment. These were families who had lived for generations in the shadow of Blackwood industry, their health and prosperity affected by decisions made in the grand mansion I had recently foreclosed upon. "We've been told for years that nothing could be done about the contamination," explained Maria Santos, whose grandmother had worked at the mill before its closure. "That testing would be too expensive, remediation impossible. Yet suddenly it's happening. Why now when it couldn't happen before?" "Because now there's someone willing to prioritize it," I replied honestly. "To invest in doing what's right rather than what's easy or profitable." The meeting extended late into the evening, the community members sharing stories, concerns, and hopes for the transformed property. I listened more than I spoke, recognizing that my role was not to impose a vision, but to facilitate one that served those most affected by the Blackwood legacy of environmental negligence. As I drove home afterward, I found myself thinking about Eleanor Blackwood's journal entries from the 1930s, particularly her observations about the relationship between the family and the community that sustained it. We speak of giving back as if the wealth were ours alone to begin with, rather than created through the labor and loyalty of thousands whose names will never adorn a building. She had understood something fundamental that her descendants had forgotten: that wealth creation is inherently collaborative, dependent on community support and labor. That responsibility flows from this reality, not despite it. 3 days. Later, Preston escalated his opposition, calling a press conference on the steps of Providence City Hall. Surrounded by a small group of supporters, he denounced the mill redevelopment as erasure of Rhode Island's industrial heritage, and me personally as an opportunist exploiting a family's temporary financial difficulties. The performance might once have carried weight in a community accustomed to deferring to Blackwood pronouncements. Now it seemed desperately out of touch, particularly when contrasted with the community engagement sessions that had been documenting real concerns and hopes for the property's future. Most telling was the absence of other Blackwood family members from Preston's press conference. Even Garrett, once his most reliable ally, had distanced himself from this latest crusade, focusing instead on his new career and the gatehouse renovation. The local media coverage reflected this shift in perception. The Providence Journal's analysis noted that Preston's characterization of temporary financial difficulties contradicted documented evidence of long-term mismanagement and deliberate concealment of environmental liabilities. Several reporters directly questioned the sincerity of his sudden concern for industrial heritage, given the decades of Blackwood neglect of the property. Noah called after watching the coverage. "This is the death throes of the old Blackwood approach," he observed, making pronouncements rather than addressing problems, expecting deference rather than earning respect. "It's still creating complications for the project," I noted. "Short term, yes," he acknowledged, "but it's also highlighting exactly why the project is necessary." Preston doesn't realize he's becoming the perfect negative example, the embodiment of outdated privilege resisting necessary change. That evening, I received an unexpected email from Vanessa, Garrett's girlfriend, who had laughed when he called me worthless at the reunion. She was reaching out to apologize for her role in the family's treatment of me, explaining that she had recently ended her relationship with Garrett as part of her own reassessment of values. "Being associated with the Blackwood name once seemed like achieving something significant," she wrote. "Now I understand that true significance comes from what you build, not what you inherit or marry into. Your response to their treatment of you has been a powerful example of dignity and principle." The message was unexpected, but reflected a broader pattern I'd observed. The Blackwood reckoning had triggered reconsideration far beyond the immediate family, affecting those in their social and professional circles who had enabled or benefited from their approach. 6 weeks after Preston's press conference, the city zoning board unanimously approved our revised mill redevelopment plan, which incorporated enhanced historical preservation elements while maintaining the core commitment to environmental remediation and affordable housing. The decision effectively neutralized Preston's primary objection strategy, though I had no doubt he would seek other avenues to obstruct the project. What I hadn't anticipated was Camille's next move. She called the day after the zoning approval, her voice animated with unusual excitement. "I'm curating an exhibition," she announced, "about New England's industrial legacy, the innovations, the labor movements, the environmental impacts. I want to center it around the Blackwood mills specifically, telling the complete story for the first time." The proposal was bold, a direct challenge to Preston's selective historical narrative. "He'll see it as another betrayal," I cautioned. "Probably," she agreed, "but it's not about him. It's about acknowledging the full reality of our family's impact, both the achievements and the harm. The exhibition will include oral histories from workers, environmental data, and previously unseen company documents that Noah found in the estate before the foreclosure." Documents? Internal memos from the 1970s confirming management knew about chemical contamination issues but chose not to address them, she explained. Health complaints from workers that were systematically dismissed. The real history, not the sanitized version. The initiative aligned perfectly with Noah's historical documentation project and the community engagement work I'd been doing around the mill redevelopment. Together, they represented a comprehensive approach to accountability: legal, financial, historical, and cultural. "Will you participate?" Camille asked. "Your perspective is essential to the complete story." I hesitated, still uncomfortable with public attention. My goal had never been to position myself as the protagonist in the Blackwood narrative, but rather to protect myself and others from the consequences of their actions. "Think about it," she urged when I didn't immediately respond. "This isn't about revenge or public shaming. It's about honest reckoning with history so that real healing and progress can happen." After we hung up, I returned to Eleanor Blackwood's journal, finding unexpected guidance in her reflections from nearly a century ago. "True legacy is not in buildings or bank accounts, but in the impact we have on lives around us. When that impact has been harmful, acknowledgement is not weakness, but the only path to redemption." Perhaps participation in Camille's exhibition was another form of the accountability I'd been seeking all along, not just financial or legal, but historical and ethical, not just for the current generation of Blackwoods, but for the entire legacy they represented. I agreed to contribute to the exhibition, providing context for how the family's financial desperation had led to their attempted exploitation of my business and clients. My participation would be focused not on personal grievance, but on the broader pattern of ethical compromises that had characterized the final chapter of Blackwood Enterprises. The decision brought unexpected peace. What had begun as a purely defensive action, protecting myself from the Blackwood scheme, had evolved into something more constructive. The foreclosure had been necessary, but it was only the beginning of a process that now included community healing, historical truth-telling, and the redirection of resources toward repair rather than exploitation. A week before the exhibition opening, I received an unexpected visitor at my office, Preston Blackwood himself, looking considerably older than the imperious patriarch who had dismissed my concerns 6 months earlier. His request for a meeting had surprised me enough to grant it, though I'd arranged for security to be nearby given his increasingly erratic public statements. "Ms. Reed," he began formally, declining my offer of refreshment. "I've come regarding the upcoming exhibition." "I'm not going to cancel my participation," I said directly, anticipating his request. He shook his head slightly. "That's not why I'm here. I want to. Contribute. This was the last thing I'd expected. Contribute how? Preston reached into his briefcase, extracting a folder of yellowed documents. These are board minutes from 1978 to 1985, covering the period when the most serious contamination occurred at the mill. They document my own role in decisions to defer environmental compliance and suppress worker health concerns. I stared at him, trying to understand this apparent reversal. Why would you want these included? His weathered hands trembled slightly as he placed the folder on my desk. Because Eleanor's journal was right. The reference stopped me cold. How do you know about that? Florence told me she gave it to you. I've read it many times myself over the years. He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. My grandmother was the wisest person in our family history, and we spent generations ignoring her guidance. The result is the situation we now face. I remained skeptical. This sudden embrace of accountability seems convenient. Not convenient, he corrected. Necessary and extremely late. He met my gaze directly. I spent my life defending a legacy that I now realize was built on selective memory and strategic forgetting. The exhibition should tell the whole truth, including my part in it. The admission seemed to physically diminish him, as if the effort of maintaining the Blackwood facade had been the only thing keeping him upright all these years. Why now? I pressed. After months of fighting every step of this process? Because I finally read Noah's historical documentation transcripts, he replied quietly. The interviews with former workers, with families affected by the contamination, stories I've spent decades dismissing or denying. His voice wavered, slightly. My entire life has been devoted to preserving the Blackwood name. I never considered that the best way to honor it might be to acknowledge where we failed to live up to it. I studied him carefully, looking for signs of manipulation or strategic positioning. Instead, I saw something I'd never associated with. Preston Blackwood. Genuine humility. I'll share these with Camille, I said finally, gesturing to the documents. It will be her decision as curator whether to include them. He nodded, accepting this limited commitment. There's one other thing. He extracted a sealed envelope from his pocket. For Eleanor's journal, a companion piece in a way. After he left, I opened the envelope to find a handwritten letter addressed not to me, but to those who will rebuild what we damaged. It was Preston's personal acknowledgement of his role in the family's ethical compromises, his recognition of the harm caused, and his hope that future generations would learn from these failures. It was dated 3 weeks earlier, before his press conference, before his public opposition to the mill project. Whatever journey Preston had been on, it had been unfolding privately, even as he maintained his public resistance. I forwarded scans of both the board minutes and Preston's letter to Camille, who incorporated them into the exhibition as part of a new section titled Reconciliation and Responsibility. Preston's contribution transformed the narrative from one of simple institutional failure to a more nuanced exploration of how values are tested, compromised, and potentially reclaimed across generations. The exhibition opening drew unexpected national attention, with major publications covering it as a case study in corporate accountability and historical reckoning. Preston attended, standing quietly at the back as visitors engaged with the complex story of his family's impact on the community. He made no statements, sought no recognition for his contribution, simply witnessed the public engagement with a truth he had spent decades denying. Noah found me at the reception afterward, his expression thoughtful. "Did you expect this outcome when you decided to foreclose on the estate?" he asked. "Not remotely," I admitted. "I was just trying to protect myself and my clients from immediate harm." "Yet you catalyzed something much larger," he observed, "a kind of collective healing that might not have happened otherwise." I shook my head slightly. I can't take credit for that. Everyone made their own choices about how to respond to the situation, including you, Camille, and eventually even Preston. But it began with your refusal to be diminished, Noah insisted. With your insistence on accountability when it would have been easier to accept the role they tried to assign you. Perhaps he was right, though it felt uncomfortable to position myself as central to this transformation. My initial motivation had been self-protection, not community healing or historical reconciliation. That those larger outcomes had emerged seemed more a testament to the readiness of many people to embrace difficult truths when given the opportunity. The mill redevelopment broke ground a month after the exhibition opened, the remediation process beginning with a community ceremony that acknowledged both the site's complicated history and its potential future. Former mill workers and their descendants stood alongside environmental engineers and affordable housing advocates, symbolizing the project's commitment to addressing past harms while creating new opportunities. Preston attended this event as well, though he maintained a respectful distance from the official proceedings. Afterward, I found him standing at the perimeter, gazing at the abandoned mill buildings that had once been the source of his family's wealth and influence. "Will it be enough?" he asked as I approached, not turning from his contemplation of the site. "The remediation, the housing, the acknowledgement, will it balance the ledger?" "I don't think that's how healing works," I replied honestly. "It's not an accounting exercise where credits eventually cancel debts. It's a process that transforms both the harm and those affected by it into something new." He nodded slowly. Eleanor would have understood that. She always had a more organic view of family responsibility than the men who followed her. We stood in silence for a moment, the autumn wind carrying the scent of the nearby bay, the sound of construction equipment preparing for the next day's work. "I understand now why Garrett called you worthless at the reunion," Preston said finally. "He was afraid of you." The observation surprised me. Afraid? Of what? Of exactly what happened. That you would see through the facade, recognize the vulnerability beneath our arrogance. Preston's gaze remained fixed on the mill buildings. The Blackwoods have been trading on appearances for generations, using the family name to open doors that our actual capabilities no longer warranted. You represented a kind of clear-eyed assessment we couldn't survive. It was perhaps the most honest analysis Preston had ever offered of his family's situation. "And now? Now we have the opportunity to earn respect rather than expect it," he replied. "Some of us are embracing that challenge better than others, but it's the only path forward." As the remediation project progressed, transforming the contaminated industrial site into clean, viable land for development, I found myself increasingly engaged with the community aspects of the work. My financial expertise proved valuable in structuring the affordable housing component, ensuring it would remain accessible for generations rather than vulnerable to market pressures. Noah's environmental law practice had expanded to include several similar projects throughout New England, his experience with the mill redevelopment establishing him as an authority on transforming industrial brownfields into community assets. We collaborated professionally with increasing frequency, our shared commitment to the work gradually healing some of the personal wounds from our failed marriage. Garrett surprised everyone by becoming an effective advocate for the gatehouse preservation, documenting its historical significance and securing additional funding for its restoration as a community heritage center. The project seemed to awaken genuine passion in him, replacing his previous investment in family status with meaningful work that earned respect through contribution rather than intimidation. Camille's exhibition traveled to museums throughout the Northeast, expanding to include comparative studies of other industrial families and the communities shaped by their businesses. She established a foundation specifically focused on documenting and preserving working-class industrial history, ensuring that future narratives would include perspectives previously marginalized in official accounts. And I found myself returning frequently to Eleanor Blackwood's journal, drawing wisdom from her navigation of similar challenges nearly a century earlier. She had understood what her descendants had forgotten, that true worth isn't measured by possessions or status, but by the positive impact one creates in the lives of others. 1 year after the family reunion where Garrett had called me worthless, I stood on the observation platform overlooking the mill property, watching as the first phase of construction began on the affordable housing units. The site had been transformed from a contaminated industrial relic to clean, prepared land ready for new purpose. My phone buzzed with a text from Zoe. New client referrals up 43% this quarter. The Richardson Foundation just confirmed their interest in our advisory services. The message confirmed what I'd already observed. My business hadn't just survived the Blackwood's attempt to exploit it. It had thrived in the aftermath, strengthened by the values-based approach to finance that the confrontation had affirmed. Clients increasingly sought Reed Financial specifically because of our demonstrated commitment to ethical practices and transparency. As I prepared to leave, Noah appeared on the platform, architectural plans tucked under his arm. The community center designs were approved, he announced. Construction starts next month after the Housing Foundation work is completed. The community center had been Noah's particular focus, a facility designed to provide educational resources, health services, and gathering spaces for the neighborhoods surrounding the development. It represented a direct response to the historical pattern of extraction without reinvestment that had characterized the Blackwood approach to the community. That's excellent news, I replied. The after-school programs will be particularly valuable for working families. Noah nodded, his expression reflecting genuine satisfaction that had nothing to do with status or appearance. I never expected to find fulfilling work in addressing my family's historical failures, he admitted. But there's something right about it. Like closing a circle that should have been completed generations ago. I understood what he meant. My own journey had evolved from self-protection to community contribution, from defensive action to constructive engagement. The foreclosure had been necessary, a clear boundary against exploitation and disrespect, but it had been only the beginning of a process that continued to unfold in unexpected ways. As we studied the plans together, discussing technical aspects of the development, I realized how dramatically our relationship had transformed. The marriage built on attraction and ambition had failed, unable to withstand the corrupting influence of Blackwood family dynamics. But from its ashes had emerged a different connection based on shared values and complementary skills focused on repair rather than exploitation. "Do you regret it?" Noah asked suddenly. "Foreclosing on the estate, given everything that's happened since?" I considered the question carefully. "No," I said finally. "It was necessary, not just for me, but for everyone involved, including the Blackwoods themselves." He nodded slowly. "I agree, though I wouldn't have at the time." "That's kind of the point," I observed. "Some lessons can only be learned through painful experience." As the sun began to set over the construction site, casting long shadows across land that was being reclaimed for community benefit rather than private profit, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought us to this moment. When Garrett had called me worthless at the family reunion, he had unknowingly set in motion a process that would ultimately reveal the true source of worth, not in possessions or status, but in the courage to stand for principles and the commitment to create genuine value for others. The Blackwood generational home had been foreclosed upon, yes. But what had truly been reclaimed was something far more valuable: the possibility of building relationships, businesses, and communities based on substance rather than appearance, on contribution rather than extraction. And in that transformation, everyone involved had discovered their actual worth, measured not by what they possessed, but by what they created, not by what they took, but by what they gave. One evening, 18 months after Garrett had called me worthless at the Blackwood family reunion, I sat in my office reviewing the quarterly financial reports for the mill redevelopment project. The transformation of the contaminated industrial site into a thriving community space was proceeding on schedule, with the affordable housing units already occupied and the community center nearing completion. My phone buzzed with a message from Helen. "Have you seen the Providence Business Journal? Front page." I pulled up the digital edition to find a feature article titled, "From Family Legacy to Community Asset: The Reimagining of Blackwood Mill." The piece detailed the project's innovative approach to environmental remediation, affordable housing, and historical preservation, highlighting it as a model for similar transformations throughout New England. Most surprising was the extensive quote from Preston Blackwood. "The mill redevelopment represents the best of what the Blackwood name should stand for. Not privilege or status, but genuine contribution to the community that supported our family for generations. While the path to this outcome was painful and personally challenging, the result honors our industrial heritage more authentically than continued abandonment ever could." The public endorsement from Preston represented a remarkable evolution from his initial opposition. After contributing his documents to Camille's exhibition, he had gradually shifted from adversary to cautious supporter, though always maintaining a certain distance from the project's day-to-day operations. I was contemplating this unexpected development when my assistant announced that Thomas Blackwood was waiting to see me. Thomas had become a regular collaborator on the historical aspects of the mill project, his expertise in preservation proving invaluable as we balanced modernization with historical integrity. "Have you seen Preston's statement?" he asked without preamble as he entered my office. "Just now," I confirmed. "It's unexpected." Thomas shook his head slightly. "That's putting it mildly. Preston hasn't publicly supported anything associated with you since the foreclosure." "People change," I observed. "Even Blackwoods, apparently." Thomas smiled at that. "Especially Blackwoods when properly motivated." He placed a folder on my desk. "Speaking of which, I've found something you should see." The folder contained architectural drawings from 1972, plans for an environmental remediation system that had been designed for the mill but never implemented. The documents included cost projections, implementation timelines, and detailed engineering specifications. "These were in Preston's personal archives," Thomas explained. "He sent them over this morning, thought they might be useful for the historical documentation aspect of the project." I studied the plans with growing astonishment. They represented a comprehensive approach to addressing the chemical contamination issues, decades before such systems became standard practice in industrial settings. "The Blackwoods commissioned these plans?" I asked. Thomas nodded. "Specifically, Preston's father, the family patriarch before him." According to Preston's notes, there was a significant debate within the board about implementing them. The engineers were quite forward-thinking for the time. "But they were never built," I noted. "No. Preston's notes indicate the board voted against the expenditure, considering it unnecessarily cautious and financially burdensome, given the lack of regulatory requirements at the time." The documents revealed a road not taken, a moment when the Blackwood enterprise could have chosen a different path, one that prioritized environmental responsibility over short-term financial considerations. That alternative history now seemed poignantly relevant as we implemented modern versions of systems that could have prevented decades of contamination if installed 50 years earlier. "There's something else," Thomas said, pulling out a sealed envelope. "Preston asked me to deliver this personally." The envelope contained a brief handwritten note. "Ms. Reed, I believe my father would have appreciated knowing his foresight, though rejected in his time, is finally being realized through your work. The enclosed may be of interest. Preston Blackwood." Beneath the note lay a check for $1 million, made out to the Mill Redevelopment Community Foundation, the nonprofit entity we'd established to fund ongoing community programs at the site. Thomas watched my reaction carefully. He's been liquidating personal assets, he explained. Art collections, investment portfolios, things that weren't affected by the Blackwood Enterprise's collapse. The gesture was significant, not just financially but symbolically. Preston was acknowledging the value of the work that had emerged from his family's downfall, contributing personal resources to ensure its success. "Will you accept it?" Thomas asked. I considered the question carefully. The initial confrontation with the Blackwoods had never been about money. It had been about accountability, about refusing to be diminished or exploited. The foreclosure had been a necessary boundary, not an attempt at financial gain. Yes, I decided, not for my sake, but for the community the Blackwoods impacted for generations. This contribution belongs to them. That evening, I drove to Preston's condominium in downtown Providence, a modest space compared to the family estate, but still reflecting his preference for traditional furnishings and formal aesthetics. I had debated whether to call ahead, but ultimately decided a direct conversation was warranted. His surprise at seeing me was evident when he opened the door, but he recovered quickly, inviting me in with the ingrained courtesy that had always characterized his public persona. "The donation was meant to be anonymous," he said once we were seated in his living room, surrounded by carefully arranged family photographs and selected pieces from the estate that had fit his downsized circumstances. "The amount makes anonymity challenging," I replied, "and I wanted to understand your motivation directly." Preston was silent for a moment, seeming to consider his words carefully. "Have you ever discovered that the story you've told yourself about your life was fundamentally incomplete?" The question was unexpectedly philosophical from a man I'd always perceived as rigidly practical. "In what sense?" "I've spent the past year studying the complete financial history of Blackwood Enterprises," he explained. "Not the official version presented in annual reports and family meetings, but the unvarnished reality documented in internal memos, board minutes, and private correspondence." He gestured to a wall of binders and folders, a personal archive assembled with characteristic Blackwood thoroughness. What emerged was a pattern spanning generations, periods of genuine innovation and contribution alternating with increasingly desperate attempts to maintain appearances as actual value creation declined. I listened, sensing that Preston was working through realizations that had been developing for some time. "The pattern accelerated in my generation," he continued. "We became more focused on projecting success than creating it, more concerned with family status than actual contribution. By the time you entered the picture, we were essentially a hollowed-out institution running on fumes of former glory and increasingly precarious financial engineering." His frank assessment aligned with what I'd discovered during my investigation of the family's finances, but hearing it from Preston himself was remarkable. "The foreclosure forced me to acknowledge what I'd been avoiding," he admitted, "that I'd failed as steward of the family legacy, not because I lost the physical estate, but because I'd allowed the principles that built it to be corrupted and abandoned." He stood, moving to a side table where an antique ledger lay open. "This is the original accounting book from the first Blackwood mill, started in 1892. My great-grandfather recorded not just financial transactions, but his vision for the enterprise, to create products of genuine value, to provide meaningful employment, to contribute to community prosperity." Preston's finger traced the faded handwriting with unexpected tenderness. "Somewhere along the way, we inverted these priorities. We began to view the community as existing to serve the Blackwoods rather than the reverse. My donation is simply a small step toward restoring the proper relationship." His sincerity seemed genuine, a reflection of painful but necessary self-examination. "Thank you for explaining," I said. The funds will significantly expand the educational programs at the community center. As I prepared to leave, Preston asked an unexpected question. Do you think redemption is possible? For a family that has caused genuine harm? I considered carefully before answering. I think redemption isn't something granted by others. It's something earned through consistent action over time, through making different choices when faced with similar temptations. He nodded slowly. That's what Eleanor would have said. The work, not the words. The conversation with Preston lingered in my mind over the following weeks as the mill redevelopment project continued to progress. The affordable housing units were fully occupied, the community center's programming was expanding, and the environmental remediation was proceeding ahead of schedule. More surprising was the gradual rehabilitation of certain elements of the Blackwood reputation, not through public relations campaigns or strategic philanthropy, but through the genuine contributions now being made by family members who had chosen a different path forward. Noah's environmental law practice had become a leading voice in corporate accountability, with several significant victories securing remediation funding for communities affected by industrial contamination. Camille's museum work had expanded to include educational programming for public schools, ensuring that future generations would understand the complete story of industrial development, both its innovations and its human costs. Even Garrett was finding a meaningful role, his work on the gatehouse preservation evolving into a broader interest in architectural heritage throughout Providence. The skills he had once used to intimidate and diminish were now being redirected toward preservation and education. Not all the Blackwoods had experienced this transformation, of course. Several cousins and more distant relatives had retreated into resentful isolation, clinging to grievances and blaming me for the family's changed circumstances. Their occasional hostile comments in social settings or pointed quotes in local media had become background noise. Unpleasant, but increasingly irrelevant as the positive outcomes of the confrontation became more evident. One morning, a year and a half after the foreclosure, I arrived at my office to find Zoe waiting with unusual excitement. The Richardson Foundation grant came through, she announced, placing the official notification on my desk. Full funding for the mill project's educational initiatives for the next 5 years. The grant represented a major breakthrough, institutional recognition of the project's value from one of New England's most prestigious philanthropic organizations. The funding would secure the future of programs designed to provide technical, training, environmental education, and business development support to community members, particularly those from families historically connected to the mill. This changes everything, I acknowledged, scanning the approval documentation. The programs can expand immediately rather than in phases. There's more, Zoe added. Look at the special conditions section. The foundation had included an unusual provision. Funding for a comprehensive case study documenting our approach to transforming the contaminated industrial site into a community asset. The resulting publication would be distributed to cities throughout the country facing similar challenges with abandoned industrial properties. They want to use us as a model, I realized. Not just a model, a blueprint, Zoe clarified. They're proposing a national conference here next year, bringing together communities dealing with similar industrial legacies. The news was overwhelming. What had begun as a personal defense against exploitation had evolved into something with potential national impact. The foreclosure had been necessary to establish boundaries and accountability, but the real significance lay in what had been built. In its aftermath, that afternoon, I met with the community advisory board that helped guide the mill redevelopment, a diverse group including former mill workers, local residents, small business owners, and environmental advocates. Their involvement ensured the project remained responsive to actual community needs rather than imposed from above. Maria Santos, whose grandmother had worked at the mill, now served as the board's chair. Her initial skepticism about the project had evolved into passionate, Advocacy as she witnessed genuine commitment to community benefit. The Richardson grant is transformative, she acknowledged as we reviewed the details. But the case study may be even more significant. Other communities need to know this kind of transformation is possible. It requires resources that not every community has access to, I cautioned, aware of the unique circumstances that had made our approach possible. Maria nodded thoughtfully. True, but it also requires something more fundamental. A willingness to confront historical truths honestly, to prioritize repair over reputation. That's the part other communities most need to understand. Her insight resonated with my own evolving understanding of what had unfolded since the confrontation with the Blackwoods. The financial and legal elements had been necessary but insufficient. The crucial factor had been the willingness to acknowledge harm, to prioritize accountability over comfort, to choose repair over denial. As the meeting concluded, Maria lingered, seeming to have something more to discuss. My aunt worked in the Blackwood household, she said finally, as part of the domestic staff for almost 30 years. This connection surprised me. At the estate? Maria nodded. She has memories of you from when you were married to Noah. Said you were always kind to the staff, treated them like actual people rather than convenient furniture. The observation touched me. I had indeed made efforts to know the household, staff as individuals during my time at the estate, finding their straightforward warmth a welcome contrast to the studied formality of family interactions. She also remembers when you first visited the house, Maria continued. Said Preston made a comment afterward, when he thought no one was listening, about how you'd never truly belong there, no matter what your business accomplishments were. The revelation wasn't entirely surprising. I'd always sensed Preston's fundamental disapproval, but hearing it confirmed was still vaguely unsettling. Why tell me this now? I asked. Maria's expression was thoughtful. Because what you've helped create here proves how profoundly wrong he was. You didn't just belong in that house. You were the only one who truly understood what it should represent. Her words crystallized something I'd been feeling but hadn't fully articulated. The Blackwood estate had never just been a property, it had been a physical manifestation of values, priorities, and relationships to community. The foreclosure hadn't destroyed those elements. It had forced a reckoning with how far they had strayed from their original purpose. That evening, I found myself returning to Eleanor Blackwood's journal, particularly her reflections on times of family crisis and transformation. One passage seemed especially relevant. A family name is not a shelter behind which to hide, but a standard to which we must continuously aspire. When we fail to meet that standard, we must have the courage to acknowledge the failure and begin again with humility. The Blackwoods of Preston's generation had lost sight of this wisdom, treating the family name as an entitlement rather than a responsibility. The confrontation had forced a painful but necessary correction, one that some family members had embraced as an opportunity for genuine renewal, while others continued to resist. The following week brought another unexpected development, an invitation to speak at Providence University's annual Business Ethics Forum. The topic was corporate accountability and community renewal, with the Mill Redevelopment Project featured as a case study in responsible approaches to addressing corporate environmental impact. I had rarely sought public speaking opportunities, preferring to focus on the practical work of financial management and project development. But the invitation represented an important platform for sharing the lessons learned through our approach to the mill transformation. Noah had also been invited to participate, his expertise in environmental law complementing my financial perspective. We had continued to collaborate professionally with increasing frequency, our shared commitment to the work gradually healing some of the personal wounds from our failed marriage. "Will it be awkward?" Zoe asked when I mentioned the invitation. "Presenting together after everything that's happened?" I considered the question thoughtfully. "No, I don't think so. We've found a different kind of relationship through the work, not what we had before, but something with its own value." The forum was scheduled for early autumn, coinciding with the opening of the community center's expanded educational facilities. The timing seemed appropriate, a public reflection on the journey at a moment when its positive outcomes were becoming increasingly evident. As preparations for the forum progressed, I received an unexpected request from the university. They hoped to include Preston Blackwood in the event, providing historical context for the family's industrial legacy and perspective on corporate responsibility across generations. My initial reaction was skepticism. Preston's public statements had become increasingly supportive of the mill redevelopment, but featuring him prominently risked centering the Blackwood narrative rather than the community impact that should be the primary focus. I discussed the request with Maria and the Community Advisory Board, whose perspective I valued in such decisions. Their response surprised me. "Include him," Maria advised after considerable discussion. "Not as a central voice, but as one perspective among many." The complete story includes the Blackwood journey from exploitation to accountability. His presence acknowledges that evolution. With the advisory board's support, I agreed to Preston's inclusion, though with clearly defined parameters. His role would be focused specifically on historical context and the lessons learned from the family's changing relationship with the community over generations. The day before the forum, I met with Noah to coordinate our presentations, ensuring we would provide complementary perspectives without unnecessary overlap. We had settled into a comfortable professional collaboration, our shared commitment to the work creating a new foundation of mutual respect. "Have you spoken with Preston?" "About tomorrow?" Noah asked as we reviewed our notes at a cafe near the university. "Briefly," I replied. "He seems to understand the constraints of his role." Noah nodded thoughtfully. "It's been strange watching his transformation. Growing up, Preston was the embodiment of Blackwood's certainty, never questioning, never doubting the family's inherent rightness. Seeing him grapple with these realizations has been humanizing." I understood what Noah meant. Preston had always projected an almost caricatured patriarchal authority. His certainty, both his strength and his fundamental limitation. The humbling process of the past 2 years had revealed dimensions to his character that had previously been invisible beneath that carefully maintained facade. "People are more complex than their worst moments," I observed, or their best ones for that matter. Noah smiled slightly. "Is that forgiveness I hear?" "Not exactly," I clarified. "More like perspective. Understanding that people can change without erasing the reality of what happened before that change." It was an important distinction. The harm caused by the Blackwoods' actions, from the environmental contamination to the attempted exploitation of my business, remained real and significant. Acknowledging positive evolution didn't require minimizing or forgetting that history. The forum itself drew an unexpectedly large audience, filling the university auditorium and requiring overflow seating in adjacent rooms with video links. The community interest reflected growing recognition of the mill project's significance beyond its immediate neighborhood impact. My presentation focused on the financial and ethical dimensions of the redevelopment approach, particularly the prioritization of long-term community benefit over short-term profit maximization. I deliberately avoided personalizing the narrative, focusing instead on the structural and institutional factors that had shaped the decisions throughout the process. Noah followed with an exploration of environmental justice principles as applied to industrial remediation, highlighting the disparate impact of contamination on vulnerable communities and the legal mechanisms available to address these harms. Preston's segment came last, a carefully structured reflection on the changing nature of corporate responsibility from the Industrial Revolution through the present day, using the Blackwood enterprises as a case study in both innovation and failure. What struck me most was his unflinching honesty about his own role in perpetuating harmful practices. There was no attempt to minimize or justify decisions that had prioritized family financial interests over worker safety or environmental protection. The fundamental failure, he concluded, was not technical or even financial, but moral. We began to view the community as a resource to be extracted rather than a partner to be nurtured. The consequences of that inversion of values extended far beyond financial collapse to encompass genuine human harm. The audience's response was respectful but measured, acknowledgement of the courage required for such public reckoning, without erasing awareness of how long such acknowledgement had been resisted. The question and answer session that followed was particularly revealing. Community members asked pointed questions about accountability mechanisms, sustainability of the remediation approach, and safeguards against future exploitation. The discussion was substantive and forward-looking, focused less on assigning blame than on ensuring lasting positive impact. One exchange particularly resonated. An elderly man who identified himself as a former mill worker addressed Preston directly. "I appreciate your words today, but I worked under your father's management for 30 years. We raised concerns about chemical exposure repeatedly. Why should we believe this change of heart is genuine rather than strategic?" Preston didn't immediately respond, seeming to absorb both the question and the history it represented. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured but clear. "You shouldn't believe it based on words alone," he acknowledged. "Words are easy, especially for those of us trained in their strategic deployment. Belief, if it comes, should be based on consistent action over time, on evidence that different values are actually guiding decisions. I can only demonstrate that through ongoing choices, not through a single statement or gesture." The honesty of this response seemed to register with the questioner, who nodded slightly before sitting down. It reflected Preston's evolving understanding. That redemption wasn't something that could be claimed or declared, but only demonstrated through sustained commitment to different principles. As the forum concluded, university officials presented each speaker with a small token of appreciation: bound copies of the community center's educational curriculum, which would be implemented in the newly opened facilities at the mill site. The gesture symbolized the practical impact emerging from the theoretical discussions of the day. Later, at the reception following the event, I found myself in conversation with several community members who had been skeptical of the mill project. In its early stages, their initial concerns, that it would become another example of development that promised community benefit while primarily serving external interests, had given way to cautious optimism as they witnessed the actual implementation. "What convinced me," explained one resident who lived near the site, "was seeing how decisions were made, not just what was decided, but how community input actually shaped the process. That's been rare in my experience." His observation highlighted something fundamental about the approach we'd taken: prioritizing process as much as outcomes, ensuring that those most affected by decisions had meaningful influence over their shape. As the reception wound down, I noticed Preston standing alone at the edge of the room, observing the interactions with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. On impulse, I approached him, curious about his reaction to the day's events. "Your presentation was more candid than I expected," I acknowledged. He nodded slightly. "There seemed little point in half measures at this stage. The facts are well established. What matters now is what's learned from them." There was a quality to his demeanor I hadn't observed before, not exactly humility, but a certain groundedness that had been absent in our previous interactions. The performative aspects of his personality seemed to have receded, revealing something more authentic beneath. "Garrett called me yesterday," he said unexpectedly. "From Boston. His firm is working on a project to document historical buildings at risk of demolition due to development pressures." The information surprised me. Garrett had maintained minimal contact with most of the family since the foreclosure, focusing on rebuilding his life and career independently. "He sounded engaged," Preston continued. "Described a preservation initiative he's developing that's actually quite innovative. No mention of the Blackwood name or connections, just the work itself. There was a hint of something like wonder in Preston's tone, as if he were still adjusting to this new reality where family members defined themselves through contribution rather than inheritance. Perhaps that's the real legacy emerging from all this, I suggested. Not buildings or accounts, but people discovering what they can create when freed from the weight of appearances. Preston considered this thoughtfully. Eleanor would approve, he said finally. She always said the family name should be earned by each generation, not simply bestowed upon them. As I drove home that evening, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought us to this point. When Garrett had called me worthless at the family reunion, he had unknowingly initiated a process that would ultimately reveal the true sources of worth, not in possessions or status, but in contribution and accountability. The foreclosure had been necessary, a clear boundary against exploitation and disrespect. But its most significant outcome hadn't been the transfer of property or the financial consequences for the Blackwoods. It had been the cascade of reckonings, realignments, and renewals that followed. The opportunity for people on all sides to discover more authentic versions of themselves and their relationship to community. 2 years to the day after Garrett had called me worthless at the Blackwood family reunion, I stood in the newly completed community plaza at the heart of the mill redevelopment. Families gathered in the space that had once been contaminated industrial land, children playing in the splash pad while parents and grandparents relaxed in the shade of newly planted trees. The transformation wasn't just physical. Many of these families had histories intertwined with the mill across generations. Ancestors who had worked in harsh conditions, parents who had lived with the legacy of contamination, children who would now benefit from educational programs housed in buildings that once represented exploitation. Quite a change, observed a familiar voice beside me. Noah had arrived for the dedication ceremony scheduled for later that afternoon. The community had insisted on marking the project's completion with formal recognition of all who had contributed to its success. More than I expected, I admitted, watching a group of teenagers working on a mural depicting the site's evolution from industrial past to community-centered present. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful. Remarks from community leaders, ribbon cutting for the plaza's official opening, and recognition of key contributors. When Maria Santos called me forward, the warm applause from gathered residents felt more significant than any professional accolade I'd ever received. 2 years ago, someone told Olivia Reed that she was worthless, Maria said, her voice carrying across the plaza. Today, we see the true meaning of worth, not in mansions or family names, but in creating spaces where people can thrive, where past harms are honestly addressed, and where new possibilities emerge. As I accepted the small plaque commemorating the project's completion, I caught sight of Preston standing at the edge of the gathering. His nod of acknowledgement carried a complexity of emotion that needed no elaboration. We had traveled a long way from adversaries to reluctant collaborators in something larger than either of us had initially imagined. The Blackwood Generational home had been transformed into a boutique hotel specializing in historical tourism, its profits partially supporting educational programs at the mill site through a structured agreement that had emerged from the settlement negotiations. What had been lost as a private estate had been gained as a community resource, its history preserved while its purpose evolved. Later, as sunset painted the plaza in golden light, I sat alone by the central fountain, reflecting on the journey. From that moment of humiliation to this point of genuine accomplishment, the foreclosure had been necessary, a clear boundary against exploitation, but its true significance lay in what had been built afterward. Relationships based on mutual respect, projects centered on community benefit, and a model for addressing historical harms with honesty and commitment to repair. Garrett's cruel words at the reunion had proven prophetic, though not in the way he intended. They had revealed exactly who held true worth in that moment. Not those clinging to fading privilege, but those with the courage to stand for something more meaningful than appearances. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.